No more discussion of overconsumption of water.
All right. Whenever you're ready, Laura, you're welcome to admit everyone and get started.
Great. Let me admit everyone to our. Okay. All right, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to Chat with Green Aggies. We're really excited today to have, well, Chrissy's got a special guest there, I see, but I was going to mention our special guest, Dr. David Appel, our plant pathologist who really specializes in trees, and he's got a lot of great information for us today. But I will really quickly introduce our panelists this afternoon. As always, we have Dr. Irfan Vafai, running the show pretty much from his office at the Overton Center. We have Chrissy Seegers, our turf specialist, and her dog Winnie. Is Winnie there? Oh, looky there. There's her dog Winnie, which they are in Dallas, coming to you from Dallas. We have Dr. Mung Mung Gu in her office in College Station. And Dr. Becky Bowling. And I'm pretty sure she's not actually sitting in front of a beautiful field of wildflowers. But
I wish I was in Black Gap right now. That would be great, but
yeah,
no.
Yeah, she's probably at the Dallas Center. So anyway, it's great to have everybody on today. I am going to introduce our speaker and give him all the time that he deserves, because he's got years of experience that he might want to share with you. And also he's a great observer of what's going on. And we have been experiencing some climate extremes lately, and he's going to talk to us a bit about that. And of course about tree health. And I just want to say that if you don't know about Dr. David Appel, in this latest issue of the ISA publication In the Shade, you can read all about him because he won the Southern Division of the American Phytopathological Society Award, because he's just great. And I also one time kind of embarrassed him by saying that he had been working on oak wilt in Texas for 30 years and hadn't solved the problem yet. But you know, we all know it's a big problem. It's not no shame there. I mean, it's a big problem, and we were lucky to have him working on it.
If we could solve all the problems, none of us would have a job, right?
There you go. Right. What would they need us for? So also today on our program today, she doesn't have to talk, I don't want to make her nervous, but Fran Pontash, one of our viticulture specialists, is here. And one of the things Dr. Appel also works on is wine grape diseases, especially Pierce's disease in wine grapes. So he's got just a wealth of knowledge and experience here in Texas, and I will let him get started.
Okay,
just before, sorry, Dr. Appel,
Oh,
sorry to interrupt.
sorry.
Just before we start, if you need pesticide
fault.
applicator CUs, it's all right. If you need pesticide applicator CUs, please make sure you fill out that form in the chat. If, again, you're looking for TDA pesticide applicator CU, you have to fill out that form both before the webinar and at the end of the webinar. So you have to fill it out twice to prove your attendance at this live webinar today. I'm sorry for that interruption, Dr. Appel.
That's quite all right, really. People do it to me all the time, really. Are we ready to go?
Yes,
I would just like to point out, Laura mentioned about, I do get introduced occasionally where they say, well, oak wilt hasn't gone away. And I always am quick to jump on the entomologist about fire ants. So, you know, it seems like no matter how long we work on these things, we're just never going to clear them all up. And also we've got one here about climate extremes too today that we're going to talk about. And I first told Laura that I was going to talk about freeze damage. Well, you know, that's been a popular topic. And just this morning, I decided to get on the Chat with Green Aggies website. I guess it was the Facebook page, and looked at the list. And I noticed Laura actually talked about this very same topic, a couple of weeks ago, I believe. And she did a very nice job of it. And so I started thinking, well, I've got approach it from a different direction. So I decided to go ahead and just talk about climate extremes in general. And this is a new approach. So we're going to do a test run on this approach here this morning and see how it goes. And if it goes all right, I may permanently alter the way I talk about some of these problems. So if it seems like I look at the screen and don't recognize a slide, that's part of the reason. It's still not really fresh in my memory yet, but we're going to go ahead and take a crack at it and see how it goes. So with that, I'm going to put an image up here that was sent to me the week after the freeze. And this is from a ranch outside Johnson City. And I'm sure a lot of us have been getting slides like this. And the ranch owner asked me, what can we do about this? And I was just kind of dumbfounded. I thought there's really not a whole lot we can do about it. But we have a winter scene here that occurred the week of February 8th. And you can see a lot of direct damage to the trees covered with ice. The weight has brought down a lot of branches. And when I look at something like this, I just, I get overwhelmed really as to what the long-term impact this is going to have on a lot of parts of Central Texas. And there's really no need to remind everybody at this point as to what happened. I'm going to show this slide in a little bit and talk about how lucky we really were when you look at this particular image and the graph that's up there. You can see that we went into the winter very nicely, really. There was nothing really dramatic about it, maybe a day in November that occurred right here. Are y'all seeing my pointer as I move it around by any chance? Okay, thanks. But we went through a nice gentle decline in temperatures, and then bang, in February, the mess occurred. And as I said, we were actually pretty lucky about that. And I'm gonna come back to that in a little bit. But we're gonna combine it. Gotta put this back. We're gonna combine this with drought. And this is an image that I took in 2011 in June. And this is at an experimental vineyard that we put in Leakey, Texas. And you can see the vineyard right in the middle of the slide right here. We were planting this particular week in Leakey, and I want to call your attention to something. This was, as I said, in June, and you can see in the middle of the slide there is a low area where there was adequate soil moisture up and down this valley to allow these trees to break bud and begin to grow leaves. But as you go up the other slope on the other side and you come up the slope towards where the experimental vineyard is, you can see a lot of live oaks through here that never put on any leaves. Now these trees are still alive. This is June. And there was not sufficient soil moisture in this soil to be able to push the buds and get the leaves out. This has been one of the most, when I think back, this particular scene is one of the ones that has most left the greatest impression on me. We worked there all summer. These trees did not come out this year. And they still survived through to the following year, but many of them had no leaves whatsoever. They remained green. They were able to survive that long without any soil moisture to speak of, and reemerge the following year. They weren't in good health, but nonetheless, they were able to live through this drought. Now, Leakey, at this point in June, Leakey was way far ahead of a lot of the other parts of the state in going into the drought. Sometime between, I think it was probably June or July of 2010, the water stopped in Leakey. They didn't get any rain after that for about 8-9 months. And it was pretty dramatic to drive around in that part of the state. But I'm going to combine these two things. And again, just to remind you, this was a horrendous drought, pretty similar to the level of freeze that we had with as far as its impact to go. And so I thought I'd go ahead and combine these and talk about what the common effects of these kinds of climate extremes are on trees. So we're going to talk about, first of all, the attributes of a healthy tree. We're going to talk about in general what can go wrong with trees a little bit, and then focus in on these climate extremes, what we can expect in the future as far as diseases and other impacts go, and then a little bit about what our recommendations are for trying to deal with these. So first of all, let's talk about a healthy tree. And I like to say that trees have the same mission on Earth that every other living creature does, and that's to grow, reproduce, and defend itself. And trees, like all plants, are particularly challenged in this respect, in that they cannot get around in order to avoid stresses that are going to inevitably occur where they are located. And so therefore they have to gather their food and store it away in this one spot. And this is very critical to a tree. What we call resource acquisition and resource allocation. The acquisition occurs through photosynthesis naturally. We're all familiar with this, quite possibly one of the most important chemical processes on Earth, at least as far as we're concerned. The gathering by the tree of carbon dioxide and water, and then using the energy from the sun to make fixed carbon in the form of sugars. And then the tree moves these sugars around. There are lots of storage compartments for these sugars in the form of starches throughout the twigs, the branches, the trunk, and in particular down into the root system of the tree, where they are stored away, and then they are used for these various functions that I've already mentioned. I just might point out how critical water is as part of this whole process. It's part of the building material for this fixed carbon. It's the reaction medium in which everything occurs. And it's also the transport medium by which the tree is able to gather up supplements in order to manufacture the food it needs in order to survive. And naturally, the whole thing is done so that we can have respiration in the tree. It can use that fixed carbon for the biological energy it needs to grow, reproduce, and defend itself. I'd like to mention a few other things about a healthy tree because they're so important with what we're going to be talking about. And that's the role of growth regulators that are formed at the apical meristems. These are extremely important to the tree because it's really the formation and the transport of these growth regulators down through the tree that gives the tree its essential form, the shape of the tree, the composition of the leaves. These growth regulators in a mix, and I'm not going to go through all the biochemistry of it because it'd take too long, and I'm not a specialist in this field. But the constant flow of compounds from the apical meristems down through the twigs, the branches, and into the trunk, and out into the root systems is very, very critical for the tree and its health. And again, we've got the absorption of water to keep the constant demand there for the tree. We've got the uptake of macro and micronutrients, supplements. I think of the food in the tree as actually being the carbohydrates. And but the tree still needs other supplements in order to manufacture those carbohydrates. So we've got a few essential functions that I'm going to keep coming back to as far as tree health goes. So what can go wrong? Well, a lot of things can go wrong. And I've got a list here of a lot of the most common diseases that we see on trees in Texas. This is not exhaustive by any means. It is these are the diseases that come up the most. There are many others. And you'll also notice that there are categories of diseases here as well. The foliar diseases, branch and trunk, vascular, root rots, and under root rots, there are literally dozens and dozens of heart rots that occur that I haven't listed individually. I've also cheated a little bit and put a few non-pathogens in here that come up as diseases, and which do influence the health of the tree. So I guess technically, at least sooty mold does, not the ball moss or the lichens. If I was ever going to write a book, which I'm not, these would be the chapters in the specific items that I'd be talking about in there. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong, and we can kind of categorize these on down into two categories to make it simple for us to talk about. And these are the what I call the abiotic pathogens and the biotic pathogens. Now I would imagine that this is going to grate on some of your ears as far as what's he doing calling abiotic non-living agents pathogens. Because usually the word pathogens in most people's vernacular is going to be referring to biotic things like we have on the right. These would be the fungi, the bacteria, the viruses, these kinds of organisms that we're all familiar with. Not only do they cause diseases of trees, but they cause diseases of lots of plants, and some of them are actually very serious human pathogens as well. So we're used to referring to biotic agents as being pathogens. We're not used to it as abiotic agents being pathogens. But this goes back to my education at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, now known as Virginia Tech, and a turfgrass pathologist, a very famous turfgrass pathologist, as a matter of fact, who taught a finishing course for PhD students, who convinced us after a semester that abiotic agents are pathogens. And without going into the thinking here too much, but when you get down to the cellular and molecular level of how abiotic pathogens affect plant health, the processes are very, very similar to how biotic pathogens affect plant health. And he built on that one basic premise and convinced us by the end of the semester. Now, it's true, we had to do whatever he said to get out of the course with a decent grade. But nonetheless, those of us that went through Virginia Tech have always had this mindset. And it's particularly helps a lot when we're talking about trees. And I'll make that clear in just a little bit. So when I look at nutrient deficiencies, water relations, climatic extremes, air pollution, these sorts of things, I immediately think in terms of what are the levels of strain that occur in the tree that are produced by these stresses. And if that strain reaches a certain threshold in the health of the tree, then the tree will begin to exhibit symptoms from these various abiotic pathogens. And that's at the point at which I consider them to be pathogens, is when we start getting symptom development due to, let's say, for example, too much water, too little water, various levels of air pollution. Once we get to beyond a certain threshold, I consider them to be pathogens in their own right. And so y'all can argue with me about that at some other point. I always look forward to the discussion. And just to bring us all up to the same level, an example of an abiotic pathogen would be iron chlorosis. I imagine most of you are familiar with iron chlorosis, a lack of iron. I've got a picture of a tree that was at the entrance of the Texas Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory for many years. This willow oak suffered mightily from iron chlorosis, and we watched it die over many years. It took quite a while. Obviously, the willow oak, like other members of the red oak group, was having trouble taking up iron on the disturbed soils on which it was growing. We never measured the pH of the soil, but I imagine it was fairly high. And as a result of that, we see the classic symptoms of iron chlorosis with the green vein and the yellow background on the leaf blade, which indicates that chlorophyll is not being replaced as it's broken down, which is a natural process in a tree. And when the chlorophyll isn't replaced, then the yellow color shows through. So this would be a classic abiotic pathogen in my mind. Another one is herbicide. I've got a great example here of herbicide damage, the treaty oak down in Austin. One of the biggest, baddest examples of herbicide damage that we've seen in Texas. Even though it was just one tree, it was damaged by the application of an entire gallon of Velpar right around the base of the tree. This is a broad spectrum weed and brush control. It's used a lot in East Texas in order to kill oaks and other hardwoods to reduce competition for pine trees. So it was particularly suited in order to damage the treaty oak. The treaty oak pulled through quite, well, I'm not going to say quite nicely, but it looks very good today, in spite of all the damage that was done to it. And if you're interested in more about the treaty oak and the person that did this, I encourage you to Google it. It's a fascinating story. That herbicides don't have to be an acute problem like hexazinone. We can use weed and feed, which has herbicide in it. Now, for many, many years, Scott's Bonus S Max had atrazine in it. I imagine some of you turf specialists could elaborate on this more than I can. I've been told by Scott's that they were getting atrazine out of the product. However, I do still see bags of it with atrazine in it that are being sold. And right on the label, it says, do not apply under the branch spread of trees and shrubs. Now, the accumulation of atrazine in the soil is not going to kill the trees outright. These are chronic levels of herbicide that cause twig dieback, very slow branch death, that sort of thing. So it's not an acute abiotic pathogen like the hexazinone was on the treaty oak, but it does put a chronic stress on the tree. And this is important because we're going to be talking about just the differences between those two sorts of levels of stress that are caused by these agents. Another abiotic pathogen would certainly be drought. Trees have to respond to drought. They do so. They have to compensate for the stress that's put on the drought. And it's going to put a load on that resource allocation. As a matter of fact, every one of these agents or pathogens that I have talked about so far put a physiological demand on the trees that do require resource allocation to go on. In other words, the tree has to take the carbohydrates that it would be using for growth and reproduction, and it's going to have to start defending itself. If it's unsuccessful, the drought becomes a pathogen, we get symptoms development, and as it happened in 2011, the trees died. We can see on the bottom here in my neighborhood, water oak, blackjack oak. Poor blackjack oak we're losing blackjack oak as a component of our woods in Brazos County. It's on its way out. And then green ash on drier sites in 2011 were dying out like these were. And look at that grass right there too. And then down in Lakey, it was remarkable how the variability that occurred. I showed you a site where live oak was doing very poorly. And as I'm driving down the road, I noticed this live oak right here on the edge of a large stand of ash juniper, and the ash junipers are going out and the live oak is doing just fine. And this is another theme that I'm going to be coming back to. There's lots of variability when these stresses work on trees as far as what the outcomes are going to be. And we're struggling right now with the freeze. We act like we know what to expect, but because of the sources of variability, we're seeing things go on that we're having a lot of issues trying to resolve as we go forward. So the freeze damage, like the drought, was variable, but in this case, I'm afraid these palms all got nailed. They did not survive the whole thing. And in this case, in my way of thinking, this is the freeze acting like a lethal pathogen on these palms. So we're going to talk about a little bit about two types of freeze damage that go on as I go through this talk. First of all, I've been talking about these abiotic problems as being pathogens. As with the palms, we've got a short-term effect, which it's going to flat out kill and severely damage trees. And I'm sure we've all, well, not all of us, but those of us that are in the position to do this have been getting slides like these going, what's going to be the final outcome? We do on a lot of our trees getting a direct loss of foliage, buds, and twigs. We get this induced cellular dehydration, which occurs in the cells. And this is intentional. As the tree goes into a very, very cold conditions, the water moves out of the cells and it increases what we call the solute concentration within the cells. And that essentially turns the cellular contents into a type of antifreeze that prevents the cell itself from freezing. However, all that water moves out into the intercellular spaces and into the what's technically called the apoplast, like the xylem cells and that sort of thing. And supposedly, it's not going to freeze in those spaces unless it gets really cold. And when that happens, then we get cellular disruption, and the antifreeze property of the solutes within the cells are not going to be able to protect the trees, depending on species, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So then we could start getting damage. We saw damage to the foliage on live oaks, for example. We're seeing damage to the foliage on this loblolly pine. Down below, we see other types of direct damage on the lower left, where this eastern red cedar just essentially had a lot of broken branches on it because of the weight of the ice that occurred. We even noticed very subtle effects. I had this arborist, Kevin Belter, sent a picture in to me. He was trying to inject a tree a few weeks after the freeze for oak wilt management. And he had noticed that the bark was completely separated from the sapwood. Now, the bark was still alive, but this was only a temporary state of health. This tree was going to go. So again, this is freeze acting like a pathogen in this case. Okay, just to remind everybody, we've got the contrasting biotic pathogens. I just threw this one out there. This is leaf curl or leaf blister on oak trees. This occurs every year except this year, I might add. This freeze has done some very odd things. If we look at this middle tree of the three trees that are on the side of the Hort Forest Science Building, this middle tree most years gets a whole lot of leaf curl on it. And you can see how it's kind of light green. Now, this is a biotic pathogen. It has a disease cycle that we go through annually in the production of spores, the infection of the leaves, the growth of the fungus in the leaves, and the development of lesions. Eventually, at the end of the year, the fungus reproduces and goes into a dormant state. The leaves fall down around the bottom of the tree, and the following year, the reproductive structures then start producing spores, and the tree gets reinfected. So, and that's typical of all of our biotic pathogens. They have a regular type of disease cycle that we can follow that usually gives us a lot of tips on how we control them. And they vary from year to year. Some years this disease is greater than other years because they are under strict environmental control. So just because it's a biotic pathogen doesn't mean we pull the environment out of the expression and development of the disease. Environment is always extremely critical when it comes to biotic pathogens. So, but I'm going to take this a step further. We have the abiotic pathogens, we have the biotic pathogens, and then we have what are called the declines. And the declines are a combination of the abiotic and biotic pathogens. These are the most common types of diseases we see in Texas. I know everybody loves to talk about oak wilt, and more oak wilt. But when you come right down to it, more trees are lost to what combinations of biotic and abiotic pathogens rather than the biotic pathogens by themselves. These things occur in many different species of trees. Usually the symptoms are similar. You get poor growth, chlorotic foliage, tip dieback, and then eventually branch dieback over the years. You get also, if we could see the root system, we would see a dieback in the feeder root system of the tree. As it goes through its cycles, it would be poorly replaced as time goes by. So all these are symptoms. We also see a peculiar symptom called epicormic shoots. And I don't know if y'all are noticing at this point, but we are seeing a lot of epicormic shoots on surviving trees right now from the freeze. And this is because water sprouts, they're commonly called, or suckers, are produced in response to trauma in the tree. And this can be lots of different kinds of stress, abiotic stress and also biotic stress. And it has to do with the fact that the production of the plant hormones from the buds have been disrupted because of the loss of those buds. And therefore the tree, this is a defense mechanism, is going to allow buds that were formerly suppressed to start growing. And so this is a direct result of losing the twigs on the outside of the tree. This is a very, very common response to these kinds of stresses. And we get a lot of questions about these sorts of things, but whenever you see this on a tree, you always start thinking, what happened to the tree that allowed this to happen in the first place? And it is also a problem with drought too. It will occur then. Now, the best way to talk about declines are by using this particular slide right here. And those of you that hear me speak a lot are probably thinking that I'm going to have this put on my headstone someday. And I'm beginning to think it might be a good idea. But this is a diagram that was first developed by Paul Mannion in the early 1970s. It was also in his excellent textbook on tree disease concepts, first published in 1991. And these are factors that are grouped into 3 twists on the disease, on this cycle, that give us a way to think about declines and all the potential factors that might be involved in them in an ordered manner. This really helps with diagnosis too, by the way. And any of you that are involved with diagnosing tree diseases, this is one of the most useful tools that I have to talk about tree diagnostics. But we've got predisposing factors, which are abiotic, they're chronic. We've got inciting factors, which are abiotic and biotic, which are acute usually. And then we've got the contributing factors, which are abiotic. Now that should say biotic right there. I wish I could change this slide right now. But these are biotic factors. These are the canker-causing fungi, the wood-boring insects, and the root rots. As we move out from 3 to number 1, the predisposing factors, you can see the various things that are in these twists on the decline spiral. And you might also notice that there are some things that are on the decline spiral in the predisposing factor twist that also show up in the inciting factor twists. Things like you might equate climate change in your mind with periodic drought. So there are relationships between these various factors. I could talk about this decline spiral for the next 15 minutes very easily. But so let's focus in now on the predisposing and inciting factors. So how do these predisposing and inciting factors influence the function of the tree? Well, if they are at a very, very low level of stress, the tree is going to be able to adapt to them. It's going to go through resource allocation to compensate with stored reserves in order to go through osmotic adjustments of cell contents. We talked about that with relation to freeze. Stomatal closure is going to change. The suberization of the cells in the roots and the twigs is going to change. This takes energy in order for the tree to respond to these stresses. Now, if it's very, very mild, then we're probably not going to see any external evidence. We're going to get normal growth, reproduction, and the tree is going to be able to defend itself. Now, as we go up to moderate stress, then things start to change. All of the responses are still the same. However, the tree is going to fail to grow normally, and it's going to fail to be able to respond to resist pests and diseases. And this is where we start getting into long-term consequences. And so this is where we're starting to think about the effects of the drought and the freeze in the future. And that's probably just as important as the immediate effects that we've seen recently to these kinds of stresses. And then if we have severe stress, as I've already talked about, then we get symptom development by these causes alone. And that's where they move into being pathogens themselves. So in summary, mild stress, little strain, no detrimental effects. Moderate stress, predisposing strain, we get wilting, mild scorching of the leaves. And it's interesting that we use this term, I've been using it with drought and also with freeze. When I look at the leaves on these live oaks, I said, boy, they really got scorched off. Using it in the context of freeze, because in some ways the symptom development is very similar. But we're also going to get, and this is the take-home message right here, infection by pests and diseases that normally do these trees no harm. And that's really the focus of what I wanted to talk about today. Now, there are enormous numbers of sources of variability with these stresses. For example, with drought, I've already mentioned the fact that we get species differences in the susceptibility of the drought. Some plants, some trees are more tolerant than others to the drought, and it's going to depend on the soil type that they're growing on. Again, the genetic background of the trees, prior damage to the trees, all of these things are going to cause species variability. So I thought that, so I'm going to go ahead and go forward a slide here. That one's out of place. Like I said, I made a lot of changes to this slide set not all that long ago. We have sources of variability to the freeze as well. If you look at these two live oaks, this was taken a few days after the sun came out, and the live oak on the left got scorched off entirely throughout the crown, lost all of its leaves, and the tree on the right in the background there came through without any symptom development whatsoever. We have to ask ourselves, what are the sources of variability here? What caused the one tree to respond so differently to the same species? And we can only speculate as to what this may be. One of the things that we need to talk in terms of with this source of variability, however, are the fact that on a large tree like this, we have a lot of different kinds of tissues, and they acclimate differently. The buds acclimate differently than the cambium. The cambium acclimates differently than on the trunks than on the roots. So this acclimation is something that I think we need to give a lot of thought to in the future about the cold hardiness of potential plants that we're putting out there, and also paying more attention to the winter as it goes along and how well the plants do acclimate and become cold hardy. And as Laura said, I've been thinking about grapes a lot lately, and certainly people in the vineyards are very concerned with acclimation and how the various types of grapes acclimate. And this is one thing I just wanted to mention about acclimation and why we were lucky in this freeze this year. And it's because of the time of year it occurred. And people have been comparing storms right now, and I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to focus on the 2021 season and how nicely the trees were acclimating. And then at this point in February, they still had not yet been exposed to temperatures that would cause them to deacclimate. So they were still acclimated. If this storm had occurred 2 or 3 weeks later, we would be seeing enormous amounts more damage. We really lucked out on this one. And I know that sounds odd, but it's true. So now what can we expect? Now I've got up here drought, but I could change this to freeze as well. What kind of diseases are we going to expect to see change in the future? Well, for one thing, we can think of them as the contributing factors in the decline spiral. The twig and branch cankers are going to increase. And we saw this after 2011. Oh my gosh, hypoxyl and atropunctatum was showing up on plants that we had never seen it before. And as a matter of fact, in other parts of the year or world where they've been experiencing severe droughts to the level that we had in 2011, they even predicted that hypoxylin would be a problem, and indeed it did show up. Root rots became more prevalent. And then we have these other problems. I'm not going to go into detail about them. And just to remind everybody of what they look like, hypoxylin canker, this is on sycamore, growing on a very dry site. This is a floodplain species. This particular growing space is just a ridiculous place to put a couple sycamores. And this is what hypoxylin canker looks like. Classic contributing factor. Another classic contributing factor, Ganoderma root rot, right here with its conchs coming out of the base. These are organisms that take advantage of that stress and strain that the tree goes through in order to compensate for the predisposing strains that the abiotic factors put on them. And these organisms can then attack and kill the trees. So, I mean, a lot of people call them secondary pathogens or weak pathogens, but they are part of the most important disease syndrome that we have to deal with in Texas. The wood-boring insects are a part of this as well, just as Mannion described. These are two of the most common ones that we see on our hardwood trees. And I'm not going to go into the insects, but they also take advantage of these trees that have been predisposed by the predisposing factors, and then whatever the inciting factor happens to be that hits the tree, then these wood borers move in as well. So we can expect the same thing from freeze damage as well. Now we're talking about a level that the trees that were better acclimated, that made it through the trees, the freeze that weren't killed, depending on the level of acclimation in the particular tree. It showed some symptoms, it's going to die back, but they're going to be specimens that we may want to maintain in our landscape. And I call your attention to these two live oaks. These are on the campus of oh gosh, I can't remember the name of it, the Women's University in Denton. I was up there last week and walking around campus looking at a lot of the damaged trees. Now, you're going to see live oaks that are in this state of health that people are thinking, okay, we're going to try to keep these trees alive. But we have to keep in mind that due to their weakened state, they are going to have disease problems yet during the growing season, this coming growing season, and probably for years afterwards. We're going to start seeing an increase in heart rot problems. If you look over here on the bottom right, this is a Chinese elm here on campus with frost cracks on its trunk. And without going into heart rots too much, these are going to be locations where heart rot organisms begin to work on these trees. And it's going to decrease the lifespans of the trees, and it's also going to make them weak someday. They'll be hazardous trees. So, just as with drought, we are also going to be seeing increase in cankers, root rot pathogens, and wood borers on these trees that have been exposed to these predisposing and inciting levels of freeze damage. All right, so let's talk about treatments a little bit as I begin to wind down here. It's true, there are ways to deal with freeze when we know it's coming, but we ought to prepare ahead of time with proper site selections for various species of trees, proper species selection. There are ways to reduce heat loss. For example, this treatment in a citrus tree in which we can continue to add water during the freeze itself. And as the ice builds up, as long as we can keep adding water to it, there is going to be a heat loss, and it's going to keep the tree at about 32 degrees, the tissues, so that you can pull a tree like this through with minimal loss. We can add heat. I know that some of the arborists were telling people to go out and wrap their palms with their Christmas lights and leave them on the whole time. I still haven't heard as to how effective that was, but and certainly we can cover the plants. And then also ahead of time, have the tree properly pruned and make sure that the shape of the crown of the tree is such that you don't have weak branches, weak crotches, that sort of thing in the tree that are going to be more liable to loss of limbs when they get all that weight from the ice. We can also treat for drought as well. We can add water. There are lots of formulas out there to add water to the trees to get these trees, get them through with a minimal amount of stress. We do recommend you don't prune trees during a drought. You can prune trees during a drought as long as you don't take off more than a third of the crown. You can plant trees during a drought, certainly, and add supplemental water, but we don't recommend fertilizing during a drought because we don't want to stimulate the tree to grow too much. Certainly mulching helps out, and that's not only with drought, but also with freeze. So some of these things that we do for drought, we also need to do for freeze as well. Again, something common between the two. And then, as we mentioned with freeze, always select the right tree for the right site. So in summary then, as far as both of them occur, what are we going to go moving forward here? We want to keep these trees as healthy as we can. We want to, again, if we're going to replant, let's think about what we're replanting the next time and make sure it's well suited for the site that we've got it on. We're going to be managing, there's going to be all kinds of recommendations going forward. I'm already getting them. Should I fertilize these trees? Should I water these trees? We did have a very, very dry period after the freeze, which made things even slower for the trees to push out. We also had cool temperatures, which means that it even delayed them even more. It was very frustrating for everybody because we kept telling everybody, wait, wait, wait. And then what should have been a 2-week wait, we're still waiting for trees in some cases to see if they're going to push. There are some compounds out there that are supposed to be good for trees that are in a declining state that have been influenced by predisposing and inciting factors. One of them is called cambistat, which is supposed to increase the feeder root system on the tree and increase the chlorophyll content of the tree, which are certainly good things to do for these trees. However, I don't think the data is really out there to know how consistent this kind of a treatment is going to be. I've already mentioned proper pruning and reduce stress on the tree. And with that, Laura and my fellow Green Aggies, that's my presentation. Having never done this before, I don't know where we go from here.
We talk from here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
right.
Yeah, that's so cute. Bent Tree Drive. I hope everybody caught that. Definitely living up to its name there. So one of the questions was in the chat was, do you recommend fertilizing trees now? And I bet your answer is probably going to be it depends, right?
Yeah, it does depend. Now, I'm going to give a caveat out there. I usually hesitate in making fertilizer recommendations because of the depends. And I never know all of the depends. So when somebody calls up and says an arborist is getting ready to fertilize my tree, I usually defer to the arborist. I would say, however, somebody's asked me about pine trees. And absolutely, I would say go ahead and start hitting pine trees. And the reason for that is because pines rely on their needles for 2, 3, 4 years, whereas a lot of our hardwood trees only rely on their foliage for 1 year. And for that reason, it's probably a good idea to try to stimulate the pine tree to put on a lot of growth. So that we get a lot of needle production. And Irfan, you're over there in the middle of this, so you would probably be able to comment on it better than I do. But that's been my gut feeling. I would say that if you are going to fertilize, certainly use something mild, a very slow release, something a kind of an organic form of fertilizer, something of that nature right now, because we want to be gentle on the trees. As I said, you're gonna kick the tree into a growth phase that might be damaging. So, but if you are going to fertilize, I would say use one of the softer fertilizers that is going to be more gentle on stimulating the growth of the tree.
Hey, Dave, I have a question about what you said. Normally use organic type. Can you hear me?
Yeah, just barely though. For some reason, you're
Is
not
it
coming
better?
through as loud.
Do I have to shout?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. I'm getting very close to my mic.
Yes.
So I think when you mentioned organic fertilizer, are you referring to the slow release
Yes.
properties of
That's what I meant,
organic
yes.
fertilizer? Not necessarily that it has to be OMRI certified organic, right?
That absolutely. Yes, that's better. Well stated. Thank you. Yeah, I come from the camp that most trees really don't need supplemental nutrients unless there is something that is causing a reduction in the availability of nutrients that is obvious. Then we generally don't recommend fertilizers for trees. Now I know, but this is where the arborists come in, and they deal with the trees much more closely than I do with their clients, and they know when things occur that you're going to have to add supplements. And so, as I said, I defer a lot to it. And when we do, it's usually in the form of something broadcast over the surface. Don't get too fancy with the fertilizer. Wow.
Wow. Okay. So I was trying to share a screen, but I didn't. So anyway, but the Irfan very cleverly put the link to our survey in the chat. He also would probably have me remind you that if you do want a CEU, you need to go back into the CEU form and put your name and license number back in there again to say that you were on. But I think that someone should take up the side business of creating those headstones with the death spiral on them. I think that's something I would like for my future resting home. I think that would be
yeah, wouldn't that be great? And when they come up to the cemetery, they get a little lesson on tree
get a little
pathology.
it'd be like carrying on your legacy for forever and ever. I really like that. I mean, who among us wouldn't want that on their final resting place? Come on, y'all, say yeah. Okay. All right. Well, do we have any more questions for the great Dr. David Appel?
Well, I guess when people are typing up their questions, we could tell them what we're going to have, in the 3 weeks, after today.
Oh, yeah, sure. So this is a tree week, and so first of the month. Next week is going to be turf week.
Turf week, taking down summer weed, summer disease management. And then the next week is nursery and greenhouse, Texas native perennials and irrigation water sampling. The last week, Thursday, is on landscape. And, we're going to talk about a checklist. Is your landscape ready for summer? So that's what we're going to have for this month of May. Thank you.
Thanks. Gosh, we also got a really good question here just for Dr. Appel. Is it possible that the storage of carbohydrates in a severely damaged tree can mobilize and allow it to briefly flush, but then drop the leaves and die due to the stress from the initial damage of the freeze? Or is there some other problem coming in, some like a biotic pathogen coming in?
Yeah, that's usually what happens. But when you get a depletion of the carbohydrates, the tissue then can't respond to these contributing factors. And as a matter of fact, the contributing factors take advantage of the mobilization. When the tree converts carbohydrates to simple sugars, then the simple sugars are more readily available and they stimulate the growth of the contributing factors. So not only is the resistance going down, but the actual nutrition for the fungi that are involved shoots up. And so it's an extra stimulation there for these pathogens to be able to take advantage of trees in this state. And you will see one of the defense responses is that when you look at foliar pathogens and canker-causing pathogens, when the tree is trying to defend itself, as the pathogen goes through the tissue, it will deplete the simple sugars in the tissues in the immediate vicinity to try to slow down the rate of spread of the pathogen through the tissues. It's one of the known defense responses that's kind of shared throughout all of plant pathology. There are a number of other metabolic processes that occur, but one of them is that the tree tries to drop down the available food for the pathogen.
That's pretty clever of that tree, yeah.
Yeah, and also I'm not sure about the question as far as the tree finally is draining itself, I guess, of all the carbohydrates. Then it's going to be defenseless. As a matter of fact, the hexazinone, that's how hexazinone kills trees. It causes the leaves to fall off, the tree produces more leaves, they fall off until the carbohydrate reserve is so low that the tree has no chance after that. And the borers and the cankers start moving in.
Yeah. Hey, who wants that? Don't let your leaves fall off again and again and again. So.
Well, I do have a comment on that. Oftentimes that can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Do I need to get close to my mic or something?
No.
I can hear you fine.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can hear you.
So under some overwhelming stress, another reaction from the plants is often that they think that the end of the world is coming, and their reaction is, I need to produce some kids. Yes. So often you'll see plants may in spite of their poor health, from the stress, that they may you may find reproductive growth, and that being flowering and fruiting. And if you can think about, in the human being metaphor, that a malnutritioned mom may not bear, proper weight babies. So the flowers are not going to be that showy. The fruits may not be that viable, but at the very least that some of the plants that, they may produce seeds, and actually sometimes quite bountiful of seeds. So they're trying to, fight the stress with plenty of numbers instead of on quality. So, in which in turns, worsen the tree health. So those are some of the reactions of plants to overwhelming stress. And sometimes in production, some people will use that, to their advantage. Let's say, to hold water, sometimes to hold water to certain plants in containers so that they may flower slightly earlier. So those are just some strategies, but that's not part of the arboriculture. But just keep that in mind, that you may see oak trees flowering earlier or more, producing more seeds, which may create a little mini forest and weedy situation for you in the future.
Yeah, I think your point though, I mean, it's really important to think about trees as a long living organism, right? That needs to live over many, many years and withstand stress over many years. And so you want to kind of put in that bank of health when you can, and try not to take out of that bank of health, and then your tree can live out its good long life. Unlike, some pansy that's gonna, live for 6 months or something. So, you don't want to mess with it too much. Anyway. Yeah. Well, thank you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think we had a lot to think about, and I definitely, my mind's kind of, rolling around, but we appreciate you filling out our survey. It's our AgriLife currency, according to Dr. Bafaya. It's part of our job is to ask people if they learned anything. All the time, every day we ask people that. So, we appreciate you answering. And I really want to thank Dr. Appel for joining us today. He had so many great things to share with us. And I think I'm pretty sure that, we were all thinking about how does this apply to other things? Because it's definitely a lot of concepts that, stress is stress and can come from lots of different directions. So,
Laura,
yeah.
Laura,
Yeah.
I've tried to send a chat and it's not going through, but I've got a question if we should recommend vertical mulching at some point, and maybe even possibly use a good compost when we do that, or is that going to stress us even further?
Like this spring vertical mulching?
Yes.
I mean, certainly organic material in your soil is a good thing. I don't know if this is a bad time to go in and cut roots or not. I mean, it's kind of like pruning in a way. You want to do that in good conditions rather than in poor conditions generally.
I would say if the soil type justifies it, then yeah, probably.
Okay.
One of the things that we noticed here, I don't know if anybody else has noticed that, but weak trees certainly got killed at a higher rate than healthy trees did. We can see this on campus. But I mean, a lot of these trees in the immediate vicinity of our building, we've known that they're weak, and we can see that they really got damaged by it. And had they been vertically mulched 2 years ago or a year ago, it probably would have helped them. At this point, this is one of those mild types of things that you could do to start stimulating the feeder root system on the tree. We've also, I don't know if you guys on campus have noticed, but the post oaks, there's a high degree of chlorosis in a lot of the post oaks, which I can't account for it, but that they might benefit from some vertical mulching. It depends on the soil type. If it's highly compacted soil, then yeah, I'd probably say it would justify it, as you say, to get some organic matter down in there, some aeration, that sort of thing. So these trees are going to need their feeder root systems. There's no question about it.
Thank you.
That was a good question. So. All right, so take it kind of easy on those stress trees, but do give them the little extra, kind of slow release fertilizer, extra organic material, all those things that are generally good and helpful.
And good words of encouragement. Just go out and give them a little boost, ego boost every day.
A little hug.
Absolutely. Yeah. Put your hand on the trunk. Talk to it. Really.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Thank you all.
Okay.
Without any more great questions, we will let you go. So thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate you, and we are happy to chat with you.